Hello, folks, and welcome back to Read This. Continuing on from yesterday's episode on Richard II, here is an extended interview with Gregory Gudgeon, in which we talk more about his fantastic performance of puppet King Richard II. I really can't praise the production highly enough. It was a really, really special show, one I think about a lot. And rereading Richard II for the podcast, there's really only one person I wanted to talk to about it because I was still thinking of Gregory's show. When you walked in, you saw Gregory in paint and costume, towering over a little court, which was just a simple board with holes in it where he'd positioned his puppets, some of which were just spoons, some of which were a bit more complicated. And he had these little pen lights illuminating it all. It was like a tiny little film set. And before he even said anything, it was such a exciting premise for Richard II, knowing what's going to happen to him later in the play and seeing him here looming above everyone as if he really is the sun. And of course, Gregory was magnificent as the fey, lost, proud, insular, maddeningly brilliant, but ultimately flawed king. And it wasn't just him. It wasn't a one-man show. He was joined by Lucas Augustine, who played Bolingbroke, and several of the other puppets as well as controlling the sound. It was this just really sort of tight little set they had, festooned with props and bits of costume and lights. It was directed by Linda Marlowe, and then the wonderful puppets. And we talk a lot about the spoons and the gloves in the interview, but there are also these magnificent Czech puppets, which we get to talk about towards the end as well, which were designed by Jitka Davidova. So a huge thank you to Gregory once again for talking to me. If you haven't listened to the episode on Richard II, go and check that out. It's as I've said a few times now, it really is a favourite play of mine. So I'm particularly excited to talk about it. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gregory now. And I think I start off by asking him a fairly basic interviewer's question. Where did he first see Richard II?
I was thinking about that just now, and it goes back a long way. When I was probably in my late teens, the Royal Shakespeare Company had a London season every year, which took place at the Aldwych Theatre. And one of the highlights of a particular year in the late 1970s was a star vehicle sort of production of Richard II, I think directed by Trevor Nunn, with Richard Pascoe and Ian Richardson in the two roles of Bolingbroke and Richard. And the trick was, which was very clever, and I didn't think of it at the time, being young and didn't see very much theatre and so on. But the trick was that they alternated roles, so you would go twice. You would go to see Ian Richardson playing Richard II, and then perhaps on a following night, or the same day if there was a matinee, you'd see Richard Pascoe play it, and the other one play Bolingbroke. It was a theatrical tour de force, not just because of that. I think it was a cracking production and very, very beautiful. And I think I must have been at drama school. So I when we were asked to do one-person shows, edit together all the scenes or speeches of a particular character in a Shakespeare play, it was part of the course. That's what I chose, and I was absolutely dreadful. I was really useless at it, even though in retrospect, now that I'm much too old to play the part, I do play the part. And when I was nearer the right age to play the part, I couldn't play the part. And I'll, if you want to ask another question, do. But there's a slightly funny, self-disparaging story I could tell you about how I found out how bad I was. And that was that I had a scholarship year at this drama school. I had to pay my way. So I had keys to the college, and I used to go in very early in the morning and sweep and clean for a couple of hours before the school started. And this paid my rent or something like that. But because I had the keys, I had an enormous bunch of keys, which included the key to the staff room where the files were kept, which included the notes that our revered tutors had made on our stumbling efforts. And it was quite early on in the course. I think it was the beginning of the second year or something like that. And I made the mistake of wanting to know what they'd thought of my idea of Richard II, and opened the notes. And the most revered of all of the tutors was a fantastic woman called Hilary Wood, who now leads the course at Trinity, I think, in Dublin. Made a course, an acting course in Dublin. Absolutely brilliant teacher. And her notes, it consisted of, in a terrible sort of agitated scrawl, "Who does this boy think he is?" And I stood there at 6:30 in the morning on a sort of cold London, grey, misty morning. Absolutely, my heart sort of went cold, and I thought, "Oh, I'm in the wrong course. What am I doing? I don't know who I am." It sort of caused a sort of crisis, really. So 40 years later, when Guy Roberts in Prague said, "Do you want to do Richard II?" my juvenile self leapt at the opportunity. And it goes on, if you don't mind me talking a bit more, to the whole question of whether there's such a thing as psychology in Shakespeare. And that question that sort of now seared on my memory, "Who does this boy think he is?" came back 40 years later as a question about Richard. Who does he think he is? And then when looking for the right script, the right edition, I paid for and downloaded what's called the First Folio, friendly First Folio, I think it's called, run by 2 ex-Globe actors, and they provide the First Folio, which I can't remember the date, but it's the first time that all the plays were published, and it had a very slight difference in the line where Richard says, "Thus play I in one person many people." In many of the modern editions, in the First Folio, it says, "Thus play I in one prison many people." And that begged the same question. Is Shakespeare telling a story with a plot and wants us to focus on the walls and the dripping dank stones of Pontefract Castle, or is he asking a psychological question? Is this king somehow playing all the parts in his cell, trying to track back and see how he got there? And it's not a play which is usually associated with psychology. It's more like a chronicle. A lot of it rhymes, and it sort of owes a lot to Chaucer and 14th century literature. But one had to ask that question many, many, many times. Who's saying this? Where are we? Are we in his head? Are we really, where the stage directions say we are, or what's going on?
Before you came to your own production, were there any standout other productions you'd seen that influenced it, apart from that Trevor Nunn one? Or were you in other Richard II productions before your own?
No, I've never been in it, apart from my version, The Puppet King Richard II. Have I seen it? Yes, of course. Yes, in Paris, a wonderful theatre company called Théâtre du Soleil, run by an extraordinary teacher-director called Ariane Mushkin. And they had a grand season in 1982, 83, and it was called Les Shakespeare, and they did 2. They did Twelfth Night, they did Richard II, and each one was not just a rendition of the play, but it had also been the result of a lot of research into a very different style of theatre. So I think one of them was heavily influenced by Indian theatre. That was Twelfth Night, and one of them was heavily influenced by Japanese theatre, and that was Richard II. So they had kabuki makeup on, and an extraordinary high-pitched monotone delivery with some extraordinary swoops and things at the end, which might have raised the hackles of somebody devoted to traditional speaking of Shakespeare, but was absolutely mesmerizing to see in French, in translations, modern translations. So perhaps they felt less encumbered by the iambic, by the pentameter. And they did extraordinary physical things where whenever they appeared on horseback, they were the horses. So there were no horses, but they did all the movements of someone on a horse shying and rearing and galloping, and it was very, very physical and very, very beautiful, and rehearsed for months and months, if not years, and extraordinary. The kind of theatre we don't make, actually. Can't think of anybody who could have done that. So that's that. I saw that, and then I saw when we were at Edinburgh last year, when you saw the production, Simon Russell Beale had just played Richard.
Oh yes.
And I saw that on a live screening.
Yeah.
Very, very, very different. Very, very fast and very grim, and very tragic and brilliant in another way.
He's an odd fit, isn't he? For
yes. Yeah. Well, I was mightily relieved, because I think we're about the same age. So I was able to jettison any reservations I'd had about my age, playing Richard, who was 33, I think, at the time of the play. And he's so light on his feet anyway, Simon Russell Beale, and he's so quick and quick-witted. You really wouldn't say to yourself, okay, he's too old. You would never. No, it's not. Haven't I seen somebody else play? I have seen. Yes, I think I've seen Jonathan Slinger play Richard II. Yes, in the season at the Roundhouse. Yeah, he was marvelous.
For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the deaths of kings. How some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court.
He was no slouch, and he's not incompetent. And as a boy king, he did some very, very brilliant things, including talking down the peasants' revolt
when he was 13, 14,
something like that. Yeah. Rode into their midst and says, "I'm your king. Tell me what you want, and I will deliver it." And then the thing historically, which gave me a kind of lodestone emotionally, was he promises all these things. It's not in the play, this, of course, but the history is fascinating. So I kind of read more of the notes in the Cambridge edition than I would normally get through with this, because the history is really interesting, and I knew very little of it. And then all of his promises are rescinded by the nobles who are actually in charge, and they all have their heads cut off, and they're executed, and there's a bloodbath afterwards, and that for me suggested the origins of his cynicism,
because he'd succeeded so
because he'd met with the protesters and agreed with them and said, I will redress your grievances. And then it wasn't allowed to happen.
I was going to ask you how much, when you take on a big Shakespeare character like that, who's also a real figure, how much it's helpful to let history enter into it, or if you should consider them approach them like a fictional character?
It's a very good question, and I wish I could be steadfast one way or the other, because a lot of actors will tell you, there's why you don't go outside the play. All the answers are in the play, and just do your research within what the writer has created, the world of the play. Because if you start acting academic notes, then you're distracting yourself and the audience really away from the play, away from the world of the play. I'm showing off my bit of research because I just found it so fascinating, and his connection to Edward II, and extraordinary. How long before was Edward II?
Grandfather.
2 generations. So, grandfather. Because the succession jumps, doesn't it? It jumps a generation. Edward III.
It's great-grandfather, not grandfather.
Yes, Edward III dies, and the Black Prince has already died.
That's
so
right, yeah.
Richard II becomes king. So Edward II is his great-grandfather. He wanted to have him canonized. He thought he was a saint, and everybody else was absolutely convinced he was a sinner. But for Richard, he was iconic. And Edward's buried in Gloucester, and Gloucester is the place that Richard retreats to, first arrives at Berkeley Castle, when he comes back from Ireland, and first starts to get wind of the way the country is turning against him, and meets Bolingbroke and has that wonderful speech about, you're not bending your knee to me. Show me the hand of God that hath dismissed me from my stewardship, or whatever. And Gloucester's where Edward's buried, and that's where he had previously retreated to when the parliament that arraigns him had sort of seized control. He went and held his own parliament in Gloucester. Anyway, that's not in the play either. I'm talking about a lot of things which are not in the play, and there's a lot of the play which
well with the play, don't they? Like it's not. It doesn't seem like it's the kind of thing that would get in the way of like the Peasants' Revolt and him having a youthful success and being somewhat warped and perhaps getting a bit of a godlike complex. But I mean, look how well I handled that. And
yes,
when the rest of these old men around me were flustered.
Thy fierce hand hath with the king's blood stained the king's own land. Mount, my soul! Thy seat is up on high, whilst my gross flesh sinks downward. I here to die.
It's exquisite, though, that line, Mount, my soul. Thy seat is up on high, whilst my gross flesh sinks down, here to die. It's the best exit line you can think of, really. So is that a tragic realization? So maybe it is a tragedy. Maybe
it's one of those kind of lines that I mean, it must be a huge decision for you, a line like that, how it's played. Whether that's a triumphant moment for Richard or a desperately sad one.
It is a triumphant moment, but unfortunately for traditional or respectful Shakespeare, we have a technical hitch at that moment, so that the audience is left in doubt as to whether we're taking it seriously or not. And we have a gadget, a bit like you showed me before the interview started, where you're recording on some digital gadget with buttons on it. And we've got one of those, and I can't work it. But Lucas, who plays the stage manager stroke Bolingbroke usurper, knows how to work it. And I want to press the music to which is Handel, Messiah, so that I have a glorious soundtrack exit. And I can't find the right button because I haven't got my glasses. And so Lucas has to do it. So we I think it happened in an early performance and muddied the water so much that it felt right. Yeah. Actually. So we kept it in.
Wow. So that was a genuine
It was
hitch.
We had rehearsed me pressing the button so that Handel came on, and there was a beautiful chorus for Richard's ghost puppet to ascend into heaven with. And when it came to it, the first performance, I could not, in all conscience, press the button because I wasn't sure it was the right one, and I didn't want it to fast forward or fast back
Play
to
something
the
else.
wrong cue and play something else, which would have been worse.
A gunshot.
So I interrupted that immortal line, "Mount, Mount, my soul, thy seat is up on high," to ask Lucas if he could press the button because I hadn't got my glasses on. And unfortunately, again, if you're listening, you know, and you love Shakespeare, you should probably want to stop now. But the audience laughed, and I've long had this theory that there's no fool, there's no clown in Richard II because Richard is the clown, and that's my justification. There's a lot of the play which is not in our production because our production is very very short. It's really only an hour and a half. Some wonderful scenes we couldn't include. The very very funny scene at the end when the Duke or Merle and his parents, the Duke and Duchess of York, all in quick succession come banging on Bolingbroke's door just as he's become King Henry IV to beg at odds with each other for their son's life or their son's execution. Or you know, it's sort of tragic farce, very very funny. It's so dangerous what Shakespeare does with the genre of the play.
People who aren't very familiar with Richard II might realise they're familiar with particularly John of Gaunt's speech. Is the speechiness and the more verse, because again from a reading perspective, I think it's the thing that makes it more enjoyable. I find it much more difficult to read Shakespearean prose than the verse, because the verse has a kind of sense to it to anyone who's sort of heard a rhyme before. Even if you're not picking up on it, you can sort of find your way a bit better, I think. Is it harder to perform or easier to perform, or what kind of?
Well, with often the prose has rhythm too, comic rhythm, but generally, I think you're freer to breathe and wait and or speed up or shift the rhythm, shift the speed of it in prose. But it has its own rules. I don't think you can set yourself completely free from the poetic nature of Shakespeare just because you're in a big bit of prose. Rosalind's speech at the end of As You Like It, they're highly, highly wrought speeches with lots of rhetorical tricks in them, and but of course the verse is refined in another way, and you have to observe it. You have to count the syllables. You have to learn it by heart, and then learn it in another way, because just the sound of it won't get you through. But you can fall back on that if you've really, really, really learnt it. And then you have to be aware of where it disobeys its own rules and why that is, and why there's 11 syllables instead of 10, and why it's feminine or masculine, or why it rhymes at the end. I tell you, cutting it is, well, it feels like sacrilege. It feels like it bleeds when you cut Shakespearean verse, particularly after, I forget which play it is, but there's a play where he learns to change the thought in the middle of the line, thus making the character speaking even more brilliant and even more impossible to cut.
Yeah.
He's doing something for himself as a poet. He's making his work uneditable by doing this brilliant thing of changing the thought in the middle of the line rather than at the end of the line. So that and Richard is one of those plays, and there's you just can't, or you have to find a way of sort of kind of eliding over it, or you have to add a syllable, and that feels like sacrilege, because who am I to put in an it or a the or a thou, or whatever. But we had to cut it. It had to be cut, and everybody. There's very few people do the full text, and it was edited in his lifetime, and it was edited soon after, and so on. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was going to ask you more about couplets in particular. In fact, Bella and I were reading through. We were going to do a reading with a reading group on Zoom, actually, of Twelfth Night, and so we were practicing, and neither of us are actors, so we're both of the school of what Bella calls, and I've adopted, the reading it nicely school. And she was saying Rhyming couplets are really difficult, and if you're not an actor, your instinct, and this is true of both of us, you go into a kind of schoolish mode of you read it like it's taught rhyme at school, and it can suddenly like really deaden something because you suddenly read it like you're saying "Good morning, Miss," something
Yes.
that was just drilled into you at school. And I was going to ask you, there's a lot of rhyming, as you've said in Richard II, and they don't always come at the end of speeches in that sort of concluding sound, which is often how rhyming couplets sound if you're not very good at reading them. It sounds like you're wrapping up and handing something over. How do you make them work?
Where we were encouraged, whenever I've done Shakespearean rhyming couplets have come up, encouraged to try to, even more than usually, find the meaning in the line so that the rhyme is accidental or not the point.
Right.
But it's there for a reason. One of the reasons may be that it made it easier to learn for the actor. One of the reasons I think with Richard II is that it's a conscious echo of Chaucer. And another reason is that it makes it easier for the audience. It hooks the audience.
I was reading somewhere that I think it was John Gielgud said that everyone who does Richard II has to have a really strong command of verse. And I've seen it said widely that it's a bit of a dwindling art form and that it's maybe not taught the same way or actors aren't trained in verse reading the same way. I feel a bit like a tone deaf sort of music critic in that I can't do it, but I sort of feel like I know what I like, how I like to hear it, kind of thing. Do you think that it's changed much?
But verse speaking has changed? Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there's much less attention to the musicality of it. There are still great voices, but the impetus is not to give a virtuoso soloist performance as if you were in a concerto. The emphasis these days, as exemplified by Simon Russell Beale's the production he played Richard in, it was very physical production, and he's terrific verse speaking, probably none better, and yet he allowed himself to be subsumed into the physical event much more than you would ever dream of a Gielgud allowing himself to be, carted about the stage, hoisted, pushed, shoved, made to fall over, rolling around in, buckets of blood, and it was gory and festive at the same time, but he did manage to speak it beautifully at the same time. I think verse speaking is it'll come back. It's always there, but I think people are not as interested in it, perhaps. People don't say, well, let's go and hear the play. No. Let's go and, as they used to, and sit in the auditorium and hear the play. We go to watch the play now.
And it's still star-led, but not,
Yes, it's not a star who's going to. It's not a jazz event, or you're not going to hear what Ella Fitzgerald does with the Weimar songs of the Weimar Republic, or Bertolt, whatever, Mac the Knife. You're going to go and hear the whole orchestra, watch the whole orchestra.
I wanted to ask you a bit more about specifically your production. What came first? Did the play come first and the puppets next?
The suggestion of the play came first in 2016, when Prague Shakespeare Company wanted to celebrate or commemorate the 4th centenary, the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, by doing all of the plays. Right. And at that time, they were being kicked out of their theatre. Their sponsor had dropped out. They had no money, and so they were just inviting anybody who wanted to do a production to come and use their space whilst they still had it, and gave tremendous sort of support in media terms and so on, and publicity. So he was having trouble finding someone wanting to do Richard II. So he said, why don't you do it? Why don't you do it as a one-man show? And that rang all the bells that I started this interview with, of my abject failure to impersonate Richard II when I was a drama student. And I thought, right, yes, I'm going to try and have another go at this. And then the next day I woke up and I thought, what have I done? How am I going to play all these characters? Who's going to want to watch me being, everybody? And living in the land of puppetry here, with some very creative and talented people around who work with not just puppets or marionettes, but objects as well, and animation. I thought, oh, maybe we can do something with this. Maybe that's start at the end of the play, look back, have him playing with a sort of toy court, and construct the production that way. So that's what we did. And then wanting to do it again in the UK, just made a company of 2 and got lots of people to add, their penny's worth to it, to design and making terms. So I think I worked with about 10 people overall on the play.
Could you tell us a bit more about the connection between, I don't know if we've actually explicitly said, you're in the Czech Republic.
Yeah.
The connection between the Czech Republic and puppetry.
Well, when I went with Brigitte Dörner, who designed the puppets originally, and I said, I think I want to use objects and some puppets, and where can I find interesting things? And she said, come to this flea market. So on the coldest day of the year in January 2016, we went to an enormous flea market on the outskirts of Prague, held in a defunct steelworks, where they used to make trams and railway tracks and things. And in an area that had been cleared of industrial architecture, is sort of a wasteland of frozen mud and puddles, thronging with people all wearing 3 overcoats at once, standing in these frozen with suitcases, basically selling anything they had. And it included a lot of puppets. I was amazed. And she explained that until the advent of multiple choice television and lots of channels and lots of other media, pretty much every household here had a box theatre, and not just one but several sets of puppets with which they would tell different popular fairy stories. So one of our puppets comes from a box that had Hansel and Gretel in it. He's the groom who comes at the very end, who gets into the prison to talk to Richard. And we found a lot of wooden spoons with smiling faces, so they became the conspirators.
I think I actually held one during.
Yes, you did. Yes. We had to ask the audience to join in at times because there weren't enough hands between me and Lucas to hold all the puppets. So they become Bushy, Baguette, and Green with their perpetually smiling faces, and we just found lots and lots of really interesting things. And I'd never done object theatre before, and I thought, well, this is interesting. And how does this work? And because they had very limited range of movements, I was made to feel competent in their operation. When we later then got rod puppets, my competence was seriously called into question, and I really had to learn how puppets with lots of different moving parts can work. I'm still not there, really.
I was going to say, what's that like with everything else going on?
It feeds into any kind of multiple thinking or multiple personality that you might think Richard II contains. It really helps, actually, to be having to manipulate lots of things and work out where the puppets have got to if we've given them out to the audience, who's got, the Duke of York, who's got Northumberland, who's got Ormond, and having to get them back in our hands and carry on with this and still do the scene. It just starts to have a sort of relentless hive mind quality about it that was arduous but great fun, and added to the play and to impersonation of Richard.
Definitely. I mean, I said before that the number of ways in which Richard II as a puppet, although it's you as Richard II, your actual body, but the sort of the puppet king aspect, how that continued to kind of reap rewards throughout as a motif, I thought was just brilliant. And the moment when you started handing people out to audience members, it suddenly really, that gave you a real visceral kick of, oh, he's out of control. You know, we as this play started, Richard was really towering over his little subjects, and because you're doing all the voices, it sounds like, you know, is that Gregory the actor playing Richard and then playing Ormel, or is that Richard speaking as himself and then doing a sarcastic send-up of Ormel? But then when we suddenly are holding this character, and there's just a sense that it's all spreading out and losing control, and physically it's, you know, so many bits. It's a you get a really strong impression of he's out of control. He's lost it. He's outnumbered.
I'm glad. That's very kind of you. But it also the tide sort of starts to rise and rise and rise, and you know, until there's a sort of flotsam of gloves and gauntlets and puppets and wooden spoons and me and the crown, you know, and they're all, we don't know where they are, but we're in such a small auditorium. Of course, we know where they are really, but people have to contribute. They have to sort of participate in Richard's downfall, which I love actually. And,
well, you're throwing things around. What is it like to block? And because I know you're saying it's like sort of chaos at the end, but you clearly have to suddenly find Bushy, or suddenly have to find that glove.
Yeah.
That must be a nightmare to block. And do you have to work backwards?
You just have to go for it. I think it's once we were confident, both of us were confident, because Lucas came to the show later. Once we were both confident about who was doing what at what time, and I really lucked out with him, because he's technologically brilliant. He's a wonderful actor, and he's got compartments in his mind that can just deal with sort of anything really. So I'm in completely safe hands, and he will then work backwards and say, this didn't work because that puppet wasn't in the right hole, and we have to work that bit out, and then I have to make sure I can get to the other end to press the button for the sound cue and stuff. So it's him really
that keeps track.
And then Linda Marlowe came on board to properly direct it, and she was great and instructive, and a wonderful eye for detail, you know. No, I just the other thing was about, you asked about puppets in the Czech Republic, and a lot of those plays which the kids will have grown up playing for themselves and then gone to puppet theatre. Every town had a puppet theatre. Many still do. They will have heard things in rhyming couplets. There's a lot of the plays. There's a Faust, which every puppet company does at some time or another. It's in rhyming couplets. So that again made me think, this play isn't so very far away from being a puppet play, in a way.
And like some other of the history plays, but particularly with King Richard, because he's so high and mighty, I guess, there's a real sense of expendable bodies in it. Excuse me. There's a sense of deaths around the corner. There's an awful lot of bodies on stage, and earls, and like they're always knocking around in the history plays. And there's when things go wrong, there's going to be a pretty high body count. Another thing that really lends itself to puppets, because they feel, you know, when they are a spoon, they really feel fragile, and they feel like they're actual characters, but their physical presence is being mocked and is fragile and sort of hanging in balance.
Yeah, life is is it right? Life is cheap. He's prepared to throw away everything to safeguard his absolute, his divine right. Yeah,
including his body.
That's why it's such a dangerous play, and why, you know, as you said, I think in the introduction to Edward II, did you say about Richard II that it was the play that was commanded before Essex's rebellion?
Yes, yeah.
And Queen Elizabeth is quoted as saying in high rage to somebody, to a courtier, "I am Richard II. Know ye not that?"
Yeah.
She saw herself with her red hair and his red hair and her precarious position and his precarious position. She saw the play as very subversive.
Yeah. That's a fascinating part of Richard II's stage history. That I mean, you were saying earlier how fascinating the history of Richard II himself is, but that's something that you would
history
never,
of the play is
exactly. You'd never know, would you? You'd never guess of all of Shakespeare's play. You know, which do you think was the most dangerous? I don't think anyone would pick Richard II.
No, you'd have thought Hamlet.
Maybe Othello.
That's yeah.
But obviously, you had, as you say, had a director. But what's it like rehearsing when you're carrying the whole lot yourself, and you don't have? I mean, you have Lucas there, and you have a director, but for the most part, you are.
It's been in 3 stages. It started out as a solo show in which I had to ask the stage manager to come on at the end and kill me.
Okay.
And out of that grew, in Prague, when we first did it in Prague, and out of that grew the idea that there ought to be a visible stage manager on the stage who the audience thinks is the stage manager, and who. So that was Lucas, and eventually he usurps me and becomes King Henry IV.
Mm-hmm.
That was the second stage, and then that was glorious because Lucas not only plays the guitar but makes his own. So he plays a guitar in the show that he made, and had all the amplifier and the bits, and and was just great with the necessary technology, such as it is. And that was just like we played, really. The two of us just played together. He'd never seen the show because it was in Prague, so I had to show it to him, and then he made really practical contributions. And then I thought, I just need to get better with the rod puppets. And Linda Marlowe had done a lot of work. She did with the Georgian Theatre Company, she did a whole Hamlet where she played or voiced all of the characters, and she played Hamlet, and the other characters were puppets, but she voiced them all in a show. And I thought, well, she'll know what she's talking about. And I've worked with her many times, and she's brilliant. So she came on and finessed a lot of what we'd already done and made some great extra suggestions. It's grown and grown. I'd like it to grow more, but coronavirus lockdown's not the ideal scenario for.
No. Have you thought at all about film with maybe not this production, but maybe for it? It seems.
Well, I would love to do something where. I'd love to do something which is a crossover of Shakespeare live online with intercut sequences of cartoon characters who are the avatars of the characters we're watching live, to break up the feeling that you're in a security control room with lots of, little icon pictures on your screen of lots of faces talking at you. I would love to do something where, Twelfth Night would be very good like this, where you've got the actors live, but then some scenes are played by their cartoon avatars, which are prepared and just intercut too. There are some wonderful Czech puppet Shakespeares. There's a wonderful Midsummer Night's Dream with very childish puppets, but telling the story of Midsummer Night's Dream. So.
Oh wow! When you are rehearsing, is it helpful to think of it as you're playing all of these characters, or does that not even really occur? Is it more like I'm playing Richard and Richard's playing everyone?
I didn't know actually to begin with. I just wanted them all to have a different voice, and for them all to be remarkably different, and they were very different objects, but I wanted to invest them with real life as far as that was possible, and I could only do that through my voice. So I think it may come across that Richard's parodying people who are actually long gone by impersonating them with puppets and objects and stuff. But I think actually I'm genuinely trying to do Richard II as a puppet play.
Yeah.
And maybe it comes across as this madman in a cell somewhere just playing.
Well,
with
I think
toys.
that's the fun. Is you can kind of imagine it both ways. Just from the opening tableau, you immediately think, oh, hang on, seeing you set up your court. Or that's why I love Shakespeare done that way. When there's a bit of a, it's not just everyone in dress. Everyone's this, sort of done to scale, as it were. But when there's a bit more of a thought process for the audience of, is this, how representational is this? Or it's just fun to think of that all the way through. I was going to ask as well, how did you what was it like deciding who got what puppet? Was it more of a, we've got these puppets, how do we use them? Or did you go, I know you mentioned...
they suggested themselves at this flea market.
Yeah.
They particularly the gloves. And I thought, of course, glove puppets. There's a lot of gauntlet throwing from the Act 1, Scene 3, and when probably in the first scene, they probably hurl their gloves down. And Mowbray and Bolingbroke. It's all the way through gauntlets as a sort of symbol of a challenge or of honor. So why not make them the puppets as well? So a lot of them suggested themselves. And then when Jitka Davidkova, who made the big puppets, came along, she added a very, very elegant and demanding level of actual manipulation and puppeteering, because you can't throw those around. You've got to channel their lives and let them really talk, really speak. They've got to be as interesting as an actor would be in the part. So yeah, anyway, it's got lots of different levels, and so has my puppeteering. I'm not very basic.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this might be a bit of a boring question for someone used to touring, but I was curious because you've taken this production all over the place, haven't you, over the last few years?
Not as all over the place as I would like to be taking it. We were invited to a nice little festival in Canada in January, and that's gone by the board because the planning needs to be now, and the funding needs to be now, and that can't happen because we don't know what circumstances are going to be in January. I would love to be just going anywhere where people thought they could get 20 people together and we'd do a show.
Yeah.
But Lucas and his partner have had a baby, and now they have 4 children. So it's quite difficult for him to imagine going away for a long time. But I know I would love to carry on with it. And no, we've only played Prague, Brighton, Edinburgh, and two towns in Scotland.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was going to ask you, is there a variable response depending on where you go to something that's not only Shakespeare but puppetry as well?
It depends on the audience, and one of the more pleasing parts of that has been that the kids really get it. Kids really, it's amazing to me. Young kids, like under the age where you might expect them to have read any Shakespeare or seen any Shakespeare or have been introduced to it. They like the puppets, but they also tell you afterwards about the story. They've kind of got it.
Yeah.
And so I think that comes back to rhyming couplets. I think rhyming couplets really do help the audience, as long as you're not hitting too hard. No, we'd like to go on and do more performances when.
Well, I'd love to see it back on the road again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope some way of doing it again, whether or not it's somehow semi-filmed or what.
Well, are you saying that we could film it?
Well, I don't. I know you were saying you were thinking more of Twelfth Night for that cartoon one, but I thought like the puppet setup, and particularly your the way you set out your court and sat behind it. I could imagine almost
So
being
you could
filmed in super close up,
right,
with
yeah,
those
super
little
close. So you could,
pen lights that you had. Was it a little?
yes.
Yeah, I thought that would look really quite interesting.
So we could take our time and do it sort of shot by shot and have something quite sophisticated
Possibly
by the end of it, with some of the sort of long shots.
Yeah.
Intercut. Yeah. Thank you.
So,
yes. Well, if anybody's out there with a
get in touch.
A spare studio,
Yeah,
with 5 cameras, get in touch.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to. This is a bit of an on-the-spot question, but since it's a book podcast, I was going to ask you: are there any Shakespeare books in particular that you would recommend? Whether it's a great edition or a book of Shakespearean history or interpretation or anything really.
A wonderful book called 1599, and it's the story. Am I right? It's the story of Shakespeare as a shareholder in a London theatre, participating in the most fantastic act of corporate robbery, where he and Burbage take hold of a theatre that's on one side of the Thames, physically dismantle it, and carry it to the other side of the Thames. Have I got this right?
Yeah, it's James Shapiro.
Yeah,
I think.
That's it. That's it. Yes, and reassemble it and as the Globe. It's the most wonderful, thrilling book.
Yeah,
takes you right back into the time, and it has a novel's sort of pace and excitement about it, and that's
it's a fantastic book. There's a sequel as well, I believe, which I haven't read. I think it's 1606. I think it's the year of Lear. I haven't got round to that one yet.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, let me know if you get. Well, I'll race you to read it.
Okay, yeah, you're on. Well, thank you so much. I think I'm out of questions. I think that's been so much fun to
thank you.
Chat like this.
Very interesting. Yes, to be asked about such an interesting play.
Yeah, it remains one of my absolute favourites for all the reasons we've discussed.
It's funny, the Czechs don't like it.
Oh, really?
Yes, somebody said to me, "Oh no," he quoted. I won't name him, but he's the preeminent translator of Shakespeare here in the Czech Republic, and he said to Guy, who produced Puppet King Richard II the first time we did it, he said to Guy, no, Czechs don't like Coriolanus, and they don't like Richard II, and wouldn't say any more about why. But he said that there's just no luck in it. They won't come. Don't do it. Don't bother. Was his
wow.
And I'm not quite sure why that is, or what. Guy wasn't sure either. I think he said it's maybe to do because it's such a play about failure. He's such a failure, Richard II. but he's a very successful failure. Yeah. I think it's a hugely successful player's piece of writing.
The Czechs have produced some of the best books about failure that have been ever written.
Absolutely, yes. Most of the whole of Kafka is about some kind of mordant failure.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, but older than me in the theatre often have very, very strong opinions about plays that will do well and plays that won't do well. Like some people say, "Oh no, don't touch Treasure Island. No, it's absolutely doomed. Don't. You'll have a shipwreck. Something awful will happen. Don't do it." Yeah. And then there's queues around the block. So you don't know really ever. But it's funny sometimes when people over a lifetime of being in the theatre have accumulated really, really strong lived opinions about what's going to work and what won't work.
Yeah,
I think we've lost that a bit. I think that's part of the animal spirit that Boris Johnson talks about. That we've slightly lost that totally instinctual idea about what people are going to flock to see. Another podcast.
Yeah, well, I would love to have you back and discuss it at some point.